There are debts that can never be repaid, and Lieutenant James Torres understood this truth on a scorching afternoon in Fallujah, when he pulled a dying kitten from the rubble of a building that had been reduced to dust and twisted metal by an airstrike 3 hours earlier. Pulled this tiny orange creature from a space so small that Torres had to lie flat on his stomach and reach into darkness while his spotter kept watch for snipers. And the kitten was barely breathing, was covered in concrete dust that had turned its fur gray. And Torres held it in his palm and felt its heartbeat flutter like a moth trapped against glass, and thought, this is the smallest thing I have ever tried to save in a place where I mostly watch large things die. He was 31 years old, had been in Iraq for 7 months on his second deployment, had seen enough death that he had stopped counting bodies and started counting sunsets, counting the days until he could return to a country where buildings stayed standing and children played in streets without checking for unexploded ordnance. And he had developed the particular numbness that combat requires, the ability to function while horror becomes routine. But something about this kitten, something about the way it looked at him with eyes too large for its skull and mewed so quietly it was almost inaudible beneath the distant sound of gunfire, broke through that numbness in a way that nothing else had. His team told him to leave it, told him that trying to save a cat in a war zone was the kind of thinking that got people killed, that you couldn't care about everything or you would care about nothing, that this was Fallujah in 2008 and every moment, spent not watching for threats, was a moment that could end with your name on a memorial wall. But Torres wrapped the kitten in a piece of torn cloth and tucked it inside his vest and felt its warmth against his chest while they continued their patrol through streets that looked like the end of the world. If you have ever saved something that everyone told you was not worth saving, if you have ever felt that small life depending on you in a place where death is the default outcome, subscribe to this channel right now, because what happened over the next 12 years will prove that the debts we think we owe are sometimes nothing compared to the debts others remember on our behalf. Hit that like button if you believe in loyalty that transcends species and time. And drop a comment telling me what city and country you are watching from, because this story belongs to everyone who has ever been saved by something they once saved. He named the kitten Radar because of those oversized ears that swiveled toward every sound. Because the kitten seemed to sense danger before it arrived, would tense in Torres's vest seconds before mortar rounds hit, would go completely still moments before firefights erupted. And Torres began to think of the cat as a kind of talisman, a creature whose survival was somehow linked to his own, and he fed Radar scraps from his military rations, and gave him water from his canteen, and kept him hidden from officers who would have ordered the animal left behind or put down. The other Marines in his unit thought Torres had lost his mind, thought the stress of combat had finally broken something essential. But after 2 weeks they stopped complaining because Radar's behavior had saved them twice, had alerted them to threats they would have walked into. And superstition in combat zones is more powerful than regulation. So they helped Torres hide the cat, built him a small shelter from ammunition crates, brought him food when Torres was on watch, and Radar became the unit's unofficial mascot, the small living thing that reminded them they were still human enough to care about something that could not shoot back. Torres spent 4 months trying to figure out how to bring Radar home. Spent hours on satellite phone calls with military bureaucrats who explained in patient voices that bringing animals back from deployment was against regulations, was logistically impossible, was not something the military could support, and Torres listened to all of this and then found a veterinarian in Baghdad who was willing to forge paperwork. Found a cargo company that would look the other way for the right price. Spent $3,000 he had saved for a car on bribes and fees and the kind of creative problem solving that the military teaches you but does not officially endorse. When his deployment ended in December 2008, Torres left Iraq with his rifle and his gear and a cat carrier that he had listed on customs forms as essential equipment. And when he arrived at Camp Pendleton in California and opened that carrier in his barracks room, Radar stepped out and looked around and walked directly to Torres and rubbed against his legs. And Torres sat on the floor and picked up this cat that had survived a war zone and thought about all the things that had not survived, all the Marines whose names were now carved in stone, all the Iraqi civilians whose deaths would never be recorded. And he made a promise out loud to this animal that could not understand words, but seemed to understand everything beneath them. Said, "I will take care of you for as long as you live." The years that followed were quieter than the ones that came before, were filled with the mundane tasks of civilian life that Torres had spent months dreaming about and then found strangely hollow, because there is a particular loneliness that comes from surviving when others did not, a guilt that follows you through grocery stores and traffic jams, and all the ordinary moments that feel obscene in their ordinariness. And Torres worked construction jobs and attended community college and saw veterans, clinic therapists who prescribed pills that made the nightmares less frequent, but never made them disappear. And through all of it, Radar was there, was the one constant in a life that felt disconnected from itself. Radar grew from a kitten into a large orange cat with a personality that suggested he remembered the war zone, remembered that survival required vigilance, and he would sit in windows watching the street with an intensity that seemed military, would wake Torres at 3 in the morning by sitting on his chest and staring at him until Torres opened his eyes. And Torres came to understand that Radar had appointed himself guardian, had decided that the debt of rescue created an obligation that would never expire, and there was something comforting about being watched over by a creature that weighed 12 pounds and could not protect him from anything except perhaps his own isolation. Torres met Sarah in 2012. Met her at a coffee shop where he was studying for an exam and she was reading a book about the Iraq War, and they talked for 3 hours about things Torres usually did not talk about what it meant to come home from a place that never left you, about the way memory worked differently when it contained things that should not be remembered. And when he told her about Radar, about pulling a kitten from rubble while his team kept watch for snipers, she did not look at him like he was crazy or broken. She looked at him like he was someone who had made a choice that mattered. And 6 months later, when she moved into his apartment, Radar accepted her with the same careful evaluation he gave everything. Watched her for a week before finally jumping into her lap and purring. They were married in 2014. Bought a small house in 2016. Talked about children in the way people talk about futures they are not quite ready to commit to. And life had a rhythm that felt almost normal. Almost like the life Torres had imagined during those months in Fallujah, when normal seemed like something that happened to other people. And Radar was there through all of it, was getting older now, moving slower, sleeping more, but still maintaining his vigil, still watching over Torres with an attention that never wavered. In March 2020, just as the world was shutting down for reasons that had nothing to do with war, Torres noticed Radar behaving strangely. Noticed the cat following him from room to room with an urgency that was unusual. Noticed Radar pawing at his left side, at a spot just below his ribs, pawing with increasing insistence until Torres would push him away. And this went on for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of Radar obsessively focusing on this one area of Torres's body. And Sarah noticed too. Said maybe you should get that checked. Said it in a tone that suggested she was worried, and Torres said it's nothing. Said it's probably just a bruise I don't remember getting. Said it in a voice that carried the particular stubbornness of men who have survived worse things than bruises. But Radar would not stop, would wake Torres at night by pressing his paw against that spot. Would sit next to him on the couch and stare at his side with such intensity that Torres finally made an appointment with his doctor. Went in expecting to be told he had pulled a muscle or developed a hernia. Went in thinking about the copay and whether this was a waste of time and money. And the doctor examined him and felt something that made her expression change. Felt something that made her order an ultrasound immediately. And 3 days later, Torres was sitting in an oncologist's office being told he had a tumor. Had a mass the size of a golf ball pressing against his kidney. Had something that would have killed him if it had gone undetected for another 6 months. The doctor asked how he had found it, asked what symptoms had brought him in. And Torres tried to explain about radar, tried to explain that his cat had been pawing at the exact location of the tumor for 2 weeks. And the doctor nodded in the way doctors nod when they are being polite, but do not believe you. Said that sometimes animals can sense changes in body chemistry. Said it in a voice that suggested this was a pleasant coincidence rather than something that defied medical explanation. And Torres did not argue because he did not need anyone to believe him. He knew what had happened. Knew that radar had detected something that every medical exam for the past year had missed. The surgery was scheduled for April 2020. Was complicated by the pandemic and the hospital protocols that meant Sarah could not be with him. Meant he went into the operating room alone, except for the memory of radar sitting on his chest the night before. Sitting there with his paw pressed against the tumor site, as if marking it for the surgeons, as if saying this is what you need to remove. And Torres lay on the gurney being wheeled toward the operating room and thought about Fallujah. About pulling a kitten from rubble. About the way small acts can ripple forward through time in ways you cannot predict or control. The surgery took 6 hours, took longer than expected because the tumor had wrapped around blood vessels in ways that required careful extraction. And when Torres woke in recovery, the first thing he asked the nurse was whether they got it all. And she said yes, said they got clean margins. Said the pathology would take a few days, but the surgeon was optimistic. And Torres closed his eyes and thought about debt. About the $3,000 he had spent to bring a cat home from Iraq. About the way money can buy some things, but not others. Certainly cannot buy the kind of loyalty that remembers a life saved and waits 12 years for the opportunity to return the favor. The pathology came back clear, came back showing the tumor was malignant, but had been caught early enough that no additional treatment was required. Just monitoring and regular scans, and the doctor told Torres he was lucky. Told him that if they had waited another 6 months, the outcome would have been very different. And Torres nodded and did not say what he was thinking, which was that luck had nothing to do with it. That this was not chance but something else. Something that looked like a debt being paid. A life being saved by a creature who remembered when his own life had been saved. Radar is 14 now, is old for a cat, is moving slower and sleeping more, and showing the signs of age that all living things eventually show. And Torres is 43, is cancer-free, is still working construction and still seeing the veterans, clinic therapist and still having nightmares about Fallujah, but having them less frequently. And every morning he wakes to find radar on his chest. Feels that familiar weight and that rumbling purr. And he thinks about that afternoon in 2008 when he pulled a dying kitten from rubble while his team watched for threats. Thinks about how he saved Radar's life without knowing that 12 years later Radar would save his. He thinks about how we move through the world creating debts we do not know we are creating, saving lives we do not know we are saving. And he thinks about how the debts we owe are nothing compared to the debts others remember on our behalf. How a cat can carry gratitude for 12 years and pay it back in the only way a cat can. By sitting on your chest at 3 in the morning and pawing at a tumor you do not know is there. By insisting with a persistence that seems almost human that you pay attention to something you would rather ignore. By saving your life the way you once saved his. And if the story moved you, if you have ever been saved by something you thought you were saving, subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the debts we owe and the debts that are paid in ways we never expect. Hit that like button if you believe that small acts can echo forward through time in ways that change everything. And leave a comment sharing a moment when an animal changed the course of your life. Because these stories matter. These moments of connection remind us that nothing we do is truly small. That every life we save might someday save us in return, and I will see you in the next story.